Somewhere on this planet right now, someone is looking into a mirror at a pair of green eyes, and they have no idea that what they are seeing shouldn't really exist. Out of every 100 people alive today, only about 2 of them have this eye color. It is rarer than being born left-handed. It is rarer than having naturally red hair. And when a team of geneticists finally sat down to figure out exactly how it happens, they didn't find a simple answer. They found something far stranger, a trait that isn't caused by pigment at all, built from a genetic arrangement so specific and so recent that it barely had time to exist before humans started carrying it across continents. By the end of this video, you'll understand why your own eyes are doing something to light right now that most people never stop to notice. For most of the last century, the explanation people were given for eye color came from a single diagram. 2 circles, a dominant trait and a recessive one, brown beating blue, with green squeezed awkwardly somewhere in between. It was the kind of chart you'd find in an old biology textbook, simple enough to memorize in one sitting, and confident enough that nobody questioned it. Brown-eyed parents were expected to produce brown-eyed children. 2 blue-eyed parents were expected to produce a blue-eyed child every time, no exceptions. It felt tidy. It felt like something you could predict with total certainty just by knowing what color your parents' eyes were. The problem is that real families kept breaking the rule. 2 brown-eyed parents would have a baby with startlingly blue eyes, something the old model insisted was almost impossible. Brothers and sisters raised in the same house, sharing the same 2 parents, would grow up with completely different eye colors, one deep brown, one gray, one an unmistakable green. For a long time, scientists treated these cases as strange exceptions, oddities that didn't need to shake the foundation of the model. But exceptions like that don't stay rare forever. As genetic sequencing became cheaper and faster, researchers were finally able to check the old 2-gene story against real human DNA on a massive scale, and what they found didn't just correct the model, it replaced it entirely. Eye color, according to large genome studies published over the past 2 decades, isn't controlled by one gene or 2. It's shaped by a whole network of genes working together, each one nudging the final result in a slightly different direction. Scientists call this kind of trait polygenic, meaning it's built from many small genetic instructions layered on top of each other rather than a single dominant versus recessive switch. This is where the story of green eyes really begins, because if you think about eye color as a wide spectrum instead of a handful of fixed categories, green sits in one of the narrowest, most delicate zones on that entire spectrum. Brown eyes can come from a fairly wide range of genetic combinations. So can blue. But green requires several separate genetic factors to line up in a fairly specific way at the same time, which is part of why it shows up so rarely compared to the other 2. To understand how that alignment works, you have to start with the gene that does more heavy lifting than almost any other when it comes to eye color, a gene called OCA2, found on human chromosome 15. OCA2 contains the instructions for a protein that controls how much melanin gets deposited into the iris, the colored ring around your pupil. Melanin is the same pigment responsible for the color of your skin and hair, and inside the eye it works the same basic way it does everywhere else in the body. The more of it there is, the darker the surface appears. When OCA2 is highly active, the iris fills with melanin and the result is a deep, rich brown. When its activity is lower, less pigment builds up, and the eye is left much lighter, opening the door to blue, gray, hazel, or green, depending on what else is happening around it. But OCA2 doesn't operate independently. Sitting right beside it on the same chromosome is a second gene called HERC2, and HERC2's job isn't to produce pigment at all, it's to control how active OCA2 is allowed to be. Researchers often describe this relationship using the analogy of a dimmer switch. OCA2 is the light itself, HERC2 is the hand adjusting how bright that light gets to shine. Together, these 2 genes account for a huge share of the difference between brown eyes and blue eyes across the human population. In 2008, Researchers digging deeper into HERC2 found something that made the picture even more remarkable. Inside a section of the gene that doesn't even code for a protein, a region known as an intron, they identified a single genetic variant, officially labeled IS129138332, that had an outsized influence on eye color. At this one specific spot in your DNA, out of the roughly 3 billion letters that make up the human genome, the difference between one chemical letter and another correlates strongly with whether a person tends to have brown eyes or lighter eyes. It's a striking example of how a tiny variation, tucked away in a part of the genome that doesn't even build anything, can still ripple outward into something as visible as eye color. Later research added another layer on top of that. Certain variants located within OCA2 itself can fine-tune how strongly that HERC2 switch actually gets expressed, which is part of why two people can carry a similar genetic variant at that spot and still end up with eyes that look noticeably different from each other. All of that explains the melanin side of the equation extremely well, the sliding scale from dark brown down to pale blue. But melanin alone cannot explain green. And this is the part of the research that genuinely surprised scientists studying it, because green eyes don't come from a green pigment at all. There isn't one. No molecule inside a human iris is tinted the color of moss, emerald, or sea glass, no matter how vivid or saturated a person's green eyes appear to be. What's actually happening is a combination of a very small amount of pigment and a physical effect involving how light behaves when it interacts with tissue. To see how that works, it helps to look at the actual structure of the iris. The outer layer, called the stroma, isn't a flat sheet of solid color. It's a loose, semi-transparent mesh made of collagen fibers, threaded through with a pale yellowish pigment called lipochrome. When light enters the eye and strikes that mesh of collagen fibers, something happens that has almost nothing to do with pigment and everything to do with basic physics. Shorter wavelengths of light, toward the blue end of the spectrum, scatter more easily off small structures than longer wavelengths do. That scattered blue light bounces back out toward whoever is looking at the eye. This is the same basic principle that explains why the sky looks blue, sunlight scattering off molecules in the atmosphere, with blue wavelengths scattering the most. A person with blue eyes doesn't have blue pigment sitting in their iris. They have a stroma with very little melanin, scattering light in a way our eyes interpret as blue. Now layer that pale yellow lipochrome pigment on top of that scattered blue light, and the two combine visually the same way blue and yellow paint would blend on a canvas, producing green. That's the underlying mechanism, structural blue light, created by scattering off collagen fibers, filtered through a light wash of yellow pigment. Adjust the amount of melanin and lipochrome even slightly, and the same eye can shift toward hazel, amber, or a pale grayish blue. This also explains something that people with hazel or green eyes have said for years and often aren't believed about, that their eye color genuinely seems to shift depending on the light around them, the colors they are wearing, or their surroundings. That's not imagination. It's the same physical scattering effect responding differently under different lighting conditions, combined with uneven melanin distribution across the iris. What makes this even more remarkable is how recently this particular trait shows up in the human story. When researchers analyzed ancient DNA extracted from early European skeletal remains, they expected to find long-standing variation in eye color stretching back tens of thousands of years. Instead, they found something unexpected. For most of early European history, the population was overwhelmingly dark-eyed, dark-haired, and dark-skinned. The genetic variants associated with lighter eyes, including the pathway that eventually produces green, appear to have spread relatively recently, with researchers tracing early signs of the light eye-associated HERC2 variant to populations in the region around the Caucasus Mountains and southern Siberia, dating back several thousand years, before spreading further through later migrations across Europe and Central Asia. On the scale of human evolutionary history, a few thousand years is an extremely short window, which is part of why researchers describe light eye color, and green eyes in particular, as one of the more recently established visible traits in the human species. That migration history also helps explain why green eyes are concentrated much more heavily in certain regions of the world today, particularly parts of Northern and Western Europe, including areas with strong Celtic and Scandinavian ancestry. As small founding populations carried this narrow genetic configuration with them, and it became more common through generations within those groups, the rare trait became noticeably more concentrated in specific regions, even while remaining uncommon globally. Today, researchers estimate that green eyes appear in roughly 2% of people worldwide, compared to somewhere between 70 and 80% for brown eyes and around 8 to 10% for blue, though these numbers vary depending on which population is being studied. There's also a practical health note worth mentioning here, because it's one of the more useful takeaways from this research. Because lighter-colored irises, including green ones, contain less protective melanin than brown irises do, some studies have linked lighter eye color to a somewhat higher relative risk of certain sun-related eye conditions, including a rare form of eye cancer called ocular melanoma. This doesn't mean green eyes are dangerous, or that people should be alarmed. It simply means that, like fair skin, lighter eyes may benefit from a bit more caution around strong UV exposure. Wearing sunglasses that block ultraviolet light isn't just about comfort in bright conditions. For people with lighter eyes, it's a genuinely sensible habit. Perhaps the strangest part of this whole picture is how unstable and reactive the color actually is once you understand the mechanism behind it. Because green eye color depends on light scattering off collagen fibers in real time, it isn't a fixed, stored pigment sitting there waiting to be seen. It's closer to an ongoing physical interaction between structure and whatever light happens to be hitting it in that moment. That's part of why people with green or hazel eyes so often complain that photographs never quite capture their real eye color, showing up as brown in one photo, gray in another, and only occasionally matching what they see in the mirror. It isn't a flaw in the camera. It's an accurate reflection of how sensitive this particular color really is to its surroundings. It also explains why full siblings, born to the same two parents and carrying much of the same genetic background, can end up with visibly different eye colors from one another. Because the outcome depends on a combination of several genetic factors interacting with each other rather than one single switch, even small differences in how those factors are inherited and expressed can push one sibling toward green, another toward hazel, and another toward blue or brown. They aren't drawing from entirely different genetic decks. They are getting slightly different combinations from the same one, and with this many interacting factors involved, even small variations are enough to produce noticeably different results. So the simple chart from the classroom wall wasn't just an oversimplification. It left out most of what actually makes eye color interesting. There is no single green eye gene, no clean dominant versus recessive rule, and no green pigment hiding anywhere in the eye. Instead, there's a layered system, a melanin-producing gene, a second gene regulating how active the first one is allowed to be, a single influential variant tucked inside a non-coding stretch of DNA, a thin wash of yellow pigment, and a physical scattering effect borrowed from the same physics that colors the sky, all interacting together, and all shaped by a genetic pathway that only became common in human populations within the last few thousand years. If you have green eyes yourself, you're carrying a trait that is, in a very real sense, one of the newer visible features in the human species. A genetic signature that can often be traced back to specific ancient migrations, still showing up in faces around the world today. And if your eyes seem to shift color depending on the light, the season, or what you're wearing, now you know that's not something you're imagining. It's collagen, pigment, and physics working together in real time, every time someone looks into your eyes. If you found this as fascinating as we did digging into the research, let us know in the comments what color your eyes are, and if you have green or hazel eyes, whether you've noticed them shifting color depending on the light. And if you want more videos breaking down the surprising science hiding behind everyday traits like this one, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one.